There is an old local legend in the North End neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts, the Italian-American neighborhood that clings to the city's waterfront with its narrow streets and its beautiful old churches and its aroma of garlic and tomato sauce, that on particularly warm summer days, if you stand in the right spot near Commercial Street, you can still smell molasses rising from the pavement. Scientists and historians debate whether this is physically possible over 100 years after the event, but the people of the North End will tell you it's true, and the story of why they say it is one of the strangest, most tragic, and most consequential disasters in American history. At noon on January 15th, 1919, the temperature in Boston was 40 degrees Fahrenheit, unusually warm for mid-January in New England. Just 2 days earlier, the temperature had been just above zero. The sudden warming was, as it turned out, one of the key factors in what was about to happen. A storage tank on Commercial Street, owned by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, stood 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, and it held approximately 2.3 million gallons of crude molasses, the thick, dark, heavily scented byproduct of sugar refining that is used, among other things, to produce industrial alcohol for munitions. The tank held more than 26 million pounds of molasses. It had been built hastily in 1915 at the height of World War I demand, with inadequate testing and inadequate engineering oversight, because speed and profit mattered more to USIA's leadership than safety. Workers at the tank had noticed for months that it leaked badly enough that local children would come with cups and pails to collect the free molasses seeping through the tank's seams. The company simply painted the tank the color of brown molasses to make the staining less visible. Residents of the neighborhood had reported to local authorities that the tank made strange rumbling and groaning sounds, particularly when a new shipment was added and the temperature changed. Nothing was done. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, on that unusually warm January day, the steel walls of the tank gave way in a catastrophic structural failure. The explosion of the collapsing tank was heard for miles. The noise was described by witnesses as a sound between a cannon shot and a thunderclap, a tremendous resonant boom that silenced the busy commercial waterfront for a fraction of a second before the wave hit. What emerged from the collapsed tank was not a trickle or a stream, it was a wave. 2.5 million gallons of raw molasses, released all at once from a pressurized container 50 feet tall, formed a tsunami of brown, viscous liquid that initial eyewitnesses estimated at between 25 and 40 feet in height. It moved, by various accounts, at somewhere between 25 and 35 miles per hour, fast enough that a person could not outrun it, fast enough that by the time you understood what was happening, it was already upon you. The wave hit the elevated railway structure on Atlantic Avenue first, buckling its steel supports. It hit the Boston Elevated Railway's engine house, completely destroying it. It engulfed a firehouse on Commercial Street, sweeping it off its foundation and crushing it. It hit the buildings of the North End with a force that had been calculated by later engineers to have exerted a pressure at the wave's leading edge of approximately 2 tons per square foot. Wooden structures simply disintegrated on contact. Brick structures were damaged or destroyed. The steel girders of the elevated railway, each weighing tons, were bent by the force of the wave as though they were made of cardboard. Horses tethered to freight wagons on Commercial Street were swept away. People walking on the street, eating their lunches on benches, working in the freight yards, were picked up by the wave and carried across the street, through buildings into the harbor. Some were buried under collapsed structures. Some were simply swallowed by the molasses itself. And here is where the physics of molasses becomes critically important to understanding the horror of what happened. Raw molasses in bulk is not the thin syrup you drizzle on biscuits. It is extraordinarily thick and sticky, with a viscosity that changes dramatically with temperature. At the temperatures that day, heated slightly by the unusually warm weather but still relatively cold, the molasses behaved in a way that was almost uniquely lethal. When it first erupted from the tank, driven by the immense pressure of 2.3 million gallons pressing outward all at once, It moved with the speed and force of a tsunami. But as the wave spread outward and lost momentum, it became something even more dangerous than a fast-moving wall of liquid. It became a trap. People who were knocked down by the wave or who stumbled into it while trying to escape found that molasses does not behave like water. When you fall into water, you can swim. When you fall into a thick, cold, sticky substance that grips your clothing, your hair, your limbs, and is cooling rapidly in the January air, becoming thicker and more viscous by the minute, you cannot swim. You can barely move. The more you struggle, the more the molasses grips you. Rescuers who arrived at the scene in the aftermath described something nightmarish. A dark brown landscape dotted with people who were still alive, visible above. The surface, but so thoroughly trapped by the thickening molasses around them that they could not move, could not free themselves, could do nothing but call out for help and wait. Some of those people died waiting, the molasses slowly rising, or their strength slowly failing, while rescuers worked frantically to reach them. The death toll was 21 people. This number seems small compared to the scale of the disaster, but it is almost certainly an undercount. Some bodies were not found for days. Some were so thoroughly mixed into the debris and the molasses that identification was impossible. 150 more people were injured, many severely. The financial damage was extraordinary. The cleanup took months. Hundreds of workers used fire hoses, initially with fresh water, then with salt water from the harbor, to try to dilute and wash away the molasses, which continued to seep into every crack, every drain, every alley in the north end for weeks. Ships in the harbor turned brown with it. The harbor itself was stained for months. Boston Harbor carried the smell of molasses for years. The USIA Corporation's initial response was precisely what you might expect from a company faced with evidence of catastrophic negligence. They blamed anarchists. It was January 1919. The United States was gripped by the Red Scare, and the fear of anarchist bombings was genuine and widespread. The previous year had seen a series of actual bombings by political radicals. USIA's management quickly put out the story that the tank had been destroyed by a bomb planted by anarchist saboteurs, pointing to the fact that many Italian immigrants lived and worked in the North End, and that some of them might have had anarchist sympathies. This was, to put it plainly, a lie constructed for the purpose of avoiding legal liability. There was no bomb. There were no anarchists. There was a badly built tank that a company had refused to properly inspect, repair, or replace, despite years of clear warning signs. The legal aftermath of the Great Molasses Flood was itself historically significant. A total of 119 civil lawsuits were filed against USIA by victims and their families. The sheer volume of litigation led to the appointment of a special auditor by the Massachusetts Superior Court, a retired colonel named Hugh Ogden, who spent 6 years reviewing testimony and evidence before issuing his findings in 1925. The auditor's report was unambiguous. The collapse of the tank was caused by the negligence of USIA in its construction and maintenance. The company had known the tank was defective and had done nothing. Ogden found the evidence of negligence to be overwhelming. USIA paid out more than $600,000 in settlements, approximately $10.5 million in today's money, to the victims and their families. Individual families received approximately $7,000 each, a significant sum in 1919, but a fraction of what the true cost of the disaster had been to the community. The historical significance of the Great Molasses Flood extends well beyond its sheer strangeness as an event. The litigation and the auditor's findings represented one of the earliest and most significant instances of corporate liability for industrial negligence in American legal history. The case helped establish the principle that corporations could be held financially responsible for failing to maintain their facilities to a standard of safety, a principle that would form one of the cornerstones of industrial safety law in the United States for the century that followed. In a very real sense, the 21 people who died in the Molasses Flood of 1919 and the 119 lawsuits that followed helped build the legal framework that protects American workers and communities from corporate negligence to this day. The science of what happened at Commercial Street has been revisited in the decades since the disaster, and it has yielded some remarkable insights. Researchers at Harvard and MIT have conducted studies of the fluid dynamics of the molasses wave, using computer modeling and physical simulations to understand how it moved and why it was so deadly. Their findings confirmed what the survivors described. The combination of the enormous volume of liquid released all at once, the pressure built up inside the tank, the temperature conditions that day, and the physical properties of molasses created something uniquely deadly, a substance that could move fast enough to kill you if you were in its path, but that would then trap you alive if you survived its initial impact. One study found that the wave traveled at approximately 35 miles at its peak, faster than the fastest human sprinter. Another found that as the temperature dropped through the afternoon following the disaster, the molasses thickened to the consistency of cold tar, making rescue operations exponentially more difficult. There is one other dimension to the molasses disaster that tends to get lost in the sensational aspects of the story: the war context. The tank on Commercial Street held molasses because molasses can be fermented to produce ethanol, and ethanol was a critical ingredient in the manufacture of munitions, specifically in the production of cordite, a propellant used in artillery, shells, and bullets. During World War I, the demand for industrial alcohol was enormous, and USIA had made vast profits fulfilling government contracts. The tank on Commercial Street had been hastily expanded and inadequately reinforced specifically to meet wartime demand, and a final large delivery of molasses had been made to it in December 1918, after the war had already ended, because the company wanted to make enough rum and industrial alcohol to sell before Prohibition took effect. The 18th Amendment was ratified on January 16, 1919, the very day after the disaster. The greed that built the tank was the same greed that killed 21 people. The rush to get rich from war, and then from a last rush of alcohol production before Prohibition, made the tank a ticking time bomb, and the North End paid the price. Epilogue. What these three stories tell us about America: three stories, three extraordinary events separated by decades and geography, connected by the common threads of institutional failure, human greed, moral compromise, and, eventually, human reckoning. The USS Indianapolis tells us about the terrible cost of bureaucratic rigidity and the heroism of ordinary men pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. It tells us that institutions can fail even when the individuals within them are not evil. That systems can be so poorly designed, so riddled with assumptions and unspoken rules, that they become effectively indistinguishable from systems that are designed to fail. The 580 men who died waiting for rescue that never came in the Philippine Sea did not die because anyone decided they should die. They died because no single person in the entire United States Navy considered it their specific personal actionable responsibility to notice that the ship was missing. That is a lesson America has had to learn over and over again, in contexts ranging from the failures that preceded the September 11th attacks to the governmental response to Hurricane Katrina. The lesson that the absence of a clear individual owner of a responsibility is the same thing, in practice, as the presence of a decision to abandon it. Operation Paperclip tells us about the price that America was willing to pay, and the price it forced others to pay, in the pursuit of technological supremacy and national security. It tells us that the promise of American values has always been in tension with the imperatives of American power, and that when those things conflict, power has often won. It raises questions that do not have easy answers. Would the United States have been able to beat the Soviets in the space race without von Braun and his colleagues? Possibly not. The Soviet space program, which also used German rocket expertise through its own parallel program, was enormously capable, and without the technical head start provided by the paperclip scientists, the first humans on the moon might have spoken Russian. Does that outcome, Americans on the moon, the technological and moral prestige that came with it, the Cold War advantage it provided, justify what was done to bring it about? The survivors of Dora Mittelbau, or their children, or their grandchildren, may be forgiven for reaching a different conclusion than the engineers who stood in mission control in Houston on July 20th, 1969, and wept with joy. The Great Molasses Flood tells us about corporate power, about the American tendency to prioritize profit over safety, about the way that vulnerable communities, the immigrant workers of Boston's North End in 1919, the communities of color that would live near chemical plants and oil refineries for generations afterward, pay the heaviest price for the recklessness of the powerful. But it also tells us something genuinely hopeful, that the legal system, when it functions as intended, can create lasting change. The 6 years of litigation that followed the molasses disaster helped build the body of corporate liability law that has protected American workers and communities for a century. The people who died in the molasses deserved better. The people who came after them, who were protected by laws strengthened in the aftermath of those deaths, perhaps lived a little safer because of what happened on Commercial Street on January 15, 1919. What unites all three stories is the most fundamental and inescapable truth of history, that the past is not past. The men who died on the Indianapolis are still down there in the Philippine Sea at 18,000 feet in the ship that the Microsoft billionaire found in 2017. The survivors of Dora Mittelbau are still, in diminishing numbers, alive, some of them still demanding the reckoning they never received. The molasses is, some say, still rising from the pavement on warm summer days in Boston's North End. The past does not stay where we put it. It rises. It surfaces. It makes itself known to 12-year-old boys watching movies about sharks, to journalists writing about NASA's origins, to scientists running computational fluid models of century-old industrial disasters. It rises because the people to whom it happened were real, and their stories deserve to be told, and the lessons they contain are lessons that every generation, without exception, needs to learn again. America is a country built on extraordinary contradictions, extraordinary courage and extraordinary cruelty, extraordinary innovation and extraordinary negligence, extraordinary idealism and extraordinary compromise. The story of the Indianapolis, the story of Operation Paperclip, and the story of the Great Molasses Flood do not resolve those contradictions. Nothing does. But they illuminate them with startling clarity, and in the illumination there is something worth more than comfort. There is truth. And the truth, however strange and dark and complicated, is always the beginning of something better. These are true events. Every name is real. Every number is documented. The USS Indianapolis delivered the uranium for the bomb that ended the war and was then forgotten to die. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi war criminals to America and sent them to the moon. And on a warm January afternoon in Boston, a 50-foot wall of molasses drowned 21 people and changed corporate law forever. America is, among many other things, the country where these things happened. Understanding that is the first step toward understanding everything else.